To explore the connections between shamanism, dreams, alien abduction, hypnosis, and missing time, this is Neon Galactic, a podcast produced by PBS affiliate Key TV in Northern California. I'm your host, James Falk. Thanks for joining us. For much of human history and in almost every human culture since the very beginning, except for our own, dreams have been seen as a window to the transcendent realms, a venue for inspiration and revelation, a contact modality that bridges the disparate levels of the human mind and connects it, in some sense, with the absolute. We've all had the experience of dreams that seem more real than our waking lives, dreams that seem to communicate precognitive or otherworldly data and have an outsized impact on the rest of our lives. Our guest today, Daniel Rekshan, has written several books and spent several years studying these phenomena as a certified hypnotist, a PhD student, and a seeker after subtle truths. Alien abductions, shamanic journeys, missing time, inspiration, spiritual awakenings, and the subconscious. His work seeks to unify these recurrent human experiences in a way that accommodates their meaning, power, and reality, while at the same time exploring how what we consider real is a bare shadow of the truth. We'll discuss his work, his insights, and the intersections between the physical world, the dream world, human minds, and the alien. Thanks for joining us, Daniel.
Thank you for having me.
So, for people who may not know who you are, let's start with some biographical detail. Who are you, and how would you describe the focus and intent behind your work?
Sure, yeah, I'm a experiencer of the phenomena. That's what I identify myself as. But the question is, what is the phenomena that I'm experiencing? And that has been the question I've experienced or driven me forward since I was a child. So I'm a lifelong experiencer, and I've run through a couple different concepts as to what that is. In general, now, retrospectively, I see that they are dream-like or dream-based encounters with what people now call non-human intelligences that I once thought were extraterrestrial or possibly. Um, and the quest to understand these experiences that came to me at night, that were powerful, numinous, terrifying, transcendent, brought me to study shamanism. They made me super curious about missing time hypnosis. I got training in that. I have a master's degree in psychology from the California Institute of Integral Studies, PhD student now at the California Institute for Human Sciences, the Integral Noetic Science program, looking at these connections. And so I'm really I find myself really grounding into the framework of integral studies, meaning we're looking at objective and subjective, first person, second person, and third person perspectives and trying to bring them together, Eastern and Western. And so that has worked itself into my identity now and all of those things. Um, so ultimately, I now work with the community of experiencers in a couple different capacities. One is as a hypnotist, that's from my training. One is as just an experiencer. I want to know what's going on. I want disclosure. I want all of that. And then the others as an academic trying to make sense of what this all is. How do we study it? How do we study it ethically? And what's going on? And finally, I'm a dream worker, which is a funny word that refers to someone who works with another person's dream. And that might be as a dream researcher, asking someone, "Hey, what did you dream about last night?" and making sense of that. That might be as a someone who helps interpret dreams. That's like the prophet Daniel in the Bible. That's where my name, Daniel, comes from. And so I look to his work in the Bible, being a dream interpreter for kings, right? Often in dangerous situations, often terrifying, often involving anomalous events and things like that, being guided through. That I found I found a sense of identity there, and I followed my dream guidance along this path. And so I offer my the DreamWork Foundation for my work and identity. That's really where it's at. It goes into dream work. I go, this is actually what I'm doing. This is what I'm about. This is where the phenomena has driven me. And so that's a brief introduction to who I am. Yeah.
Yeah, that's lovely and concise. Let's start with, can you give us some examples of what your experiences were like? So sort of ground people and kind of, I mean, if there is uh, you know, um, a categorical way of breaking experiencers down or whatever, what were yours like? How did you come about these numinous experiences?
Yeah. So One of my earliest memories, and I've shared this story a number of times on podcasts or in my own work, is when I was three or so years old. I was awake in bed, looking out the window, and I saw what I later identified to be the Easter Bunny approach the door. And I told my family, my mom, my twin brother about this. It felt really powerful to me at the time, and I really did see something. I really did look like the Easter Bunny to me. Um, and yet, even retrospectively now, I think, it could be a light being, it could be an interdimensional entity, it could be myself in a dream state thinking these things. And so, um, there's a couple different components to all of my experience. One is the raw experience at the moment of the experience, and then the on top of that, there's the years of interpretation and the years of storytelling on top of that. That was my first experience. When I was in my teenage years, I had a lot of dreams, mostly nightmares, mostly verging towards sleep paralysis, kind of terrifying ideas, mostly but like my memories of those dreams are mostly the impact of the dreams, waking up and being so terrified that is this part of the dream? Is this not? Well, where are we? What's going on? Who are those beings? What happened? Well, I can't believe my face that was just eaten off, right? Like by the nightmare entity, right, is still here. How did that even happen? That sort of thing I ended up questioning. And I also remember going to bed and having extreme rituals, right? I would do these gestures on top of my chakra points as a young fundamental Christian boy, thinking that perhaps demons were taking me. So I do signs of crosses on those things. Um, so I have several memories from that time where I go, oh, this is a powerful memory. But during that time, my father reported seeing UFOs. We saw my grandfather pass. There was my aunt had stories of seeing aliens and UFOs in cornfields, and so the those experiences that were just fragmentary dream memories that had intensity that I assumed had trauma behind them were we woven into this narrative that I now use the phrase UFO abduction syndrome to identify. And I'd love to just introduce that term to you now. It comes from 1992. It comes from literature. It was introduced by Johnny Mack, put forward by Bud Hopkins, David Jacobs, Ron Westrom, in a publication by the Bigelow Holding Corporation called the Unusual Personal Experiences. And this document was sent to 100,000 mental health workers in 1992, 1994 kind of area, and it said, "Hey, there's alien abduction, and we're calling it the UFO abduction syndrome, and it's associated with a complex of dreamlike experiences that aren't well remembered and are associated with lights in the sky or body marks." And so for me, I had the UFO abduction syndrome. That for me was what it was, and there weren't particularly concrete memories of alien abduction, but there were these powerful numinous dreams and an association with UFOs and an intuition something like that was happening. And so figuring out in the 90s, I was what, like 15 or something at the time, going like, this is alien abduction. I don't want to get into it. So that set up a kind of a dichotomy in my soul that I've been in tension with for 2 decades. And it was only after the 2017 articles came out, 2020 happened that I started going, even though I got trained as a hypnotist, I didn't practice. I go, okay, I have to unify these aspects of my soul and figure out what's going on. And so that I'm bringing in that concept kind of after the fact retrospectively, because in that time I just had these notions something real was happening. There was a real experience and there was real trauma behind it that was preventing me from understanding it. And that I knew experts outside of myself were telling other experts that's things like this were alien abduction. And
Yeah.
so, yeah.
That's there's a lot there that I want
Yeah.
to sort of get into. Now, by saying things, with this connection to the dream world and the dreaming experience, you're not necessarily debating the ontological reality of these experiences, correct? Like, I mean, is by saying something is a dream, that's not to say it purely originates within the subconscious or the sleeping brain of the experiencer. Is that right?
That's correct. There's some nuance there. Thank you for bringing that up because oftentimes when I do bring up, hey, these are dreamlike experiences, people go, oh no, they're real. Stop saying they're dreamlike. Like
Yeah.
they're absolutely real. It's offensive to say it's dreamlike because it's saying it's unreal. That's why we have to bring in, that's why I bring in dream shamanism, but it's a kind of an advanced conversation. Ultimately,
Let's have that
I,
conversation.
yeah, yeah, I'd love to. That's why I reached out. So,
Yeah.
ultimately, I say they're real. They're meaningful and they're transformative. Ultimately, if we step back and if we go, okay, they're dreamlike, and we look at it and go, oh, they're dreamlike, it still looks like real entities from another imaginal realm, a real realm. It's ontologically real, distinct entities reaching out to us, communicating to us insights regarding technology, science, math, prophecies, all
Yeah.
these things that happen through what
Throughout human history, that's been happening. Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
So that's what's and so calling that dreamlike for me goes it connects it with a rich world and history and tradition of contact that we understand can be beneficial and we can work with it and mediate those relationships. And that's why I'm calling it shamanic because that's shamanic understandings encapsulate that in our way Western people have written about this understanding that the dream world is real in some way. Now, to the Western mind, we hear dreams are on our dreams and waking reality. We hear real, unreal. And so when I say it's dreamlike, you go, oh, people go, oh, it's real. It can't be a dream. But
I
when I
didn't
say
dream that
it's
up. Yeah,
yeah,
I mean,
yeah, I didn't make it up from my imagination. But dreams come through the personal imagination. This is my practical experience. They come through the personal imagination, right?
mhm.
They respond to set, setting, and intention. But there's some real source of something coming in. There's some real interaction. So I often think about this when experiencers of classic UFO abduction syndrome talk about paralysis, right? Like they were so scared of that mantid being like this came up recently in one of the whistleblowers. Like the mantid ripped off the face of the experiencer. He was so scared that he was paralyzed. He
John
couldn't move.
Blitch, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So that was such a fascinating statement to me because he says, I was so scared that I was paralyzed. How does the paralysis happen in the experience, right? So there's oftentimes like paralysis associated with the NHI encounter, as well as memory loss. So memory loss and paralysis. And I go, how does that actually happen? This is why I bring the dreamlike nature of contact back onto the table when we're talking about this, because there's strong precedent for paralysis and memory loss in dream research. And it's just throughout all of dream research. You forget your dreams all the time. You have bizarre encounters. The qualities of high strangeness that Jacques Vallée has mentioned in his papers are the same qualities that dream researchers use to describe the bizarreness factors of REM dreams. So REM is rapid eye movement dreams. That's where we have most of our dreams. They're characterized by their bizarreness and also the feeling of reality in them. So it has physical impossibilities like the five observables, right? So are expressed in those things. So we have these natural precedents for both memory loss and paralysis in the sleep and dream state. And I often think, is it more reasonable to assume that a space alien has technology that can induce the same type of paralysis and memory loss associated with dreams through an external technology or through that fear event, right? Or is it actually a dreamlike event and you're paralyzed because that's part of the nature of the dream, right? That they're using whatever, even if it is a external NHI entity, there's a response in the body that's physiologically similar to the sleep paralysis experience. And the memory loss is physiologically similar to the memory loss associated with dreams. And I mean, so there's a lot to go from there. Um, and that's why I talk about it, because if we have an understanding that you can get paralyzed because you're so scared a mantid comes to you, rips off your face, makes you forget that it happens maybe and you remember it later, right? And is that something that's possible in the objective three-dimensional physical world, or is it mediated through the dream world? So for me, if it's mediated through the dreaming mind, then I at least have some level of control. I'm not a victim, and I can apply my understanding of dreams and nightmares to these encounters and see if I can shift them, transform them, gain insight out of them, stop having them, right? And so that's the kind of fundamental insight that I'm or hypothesis I'm applying to this work to sort of go, hang on a second. These seem like dreams, they feel like dreams. I understand in the 90s and the aughts, there was a bias against dreams because we know dreams are unreal, right? That's the Western bias against dreams. But if we set aside that bias and go, maybe dreams are real in some other way, this imaginal way, that kind of thing, then what would that look like? Could this possibly be interactions with interdimensional entities through dream experiences or dream telepathy, dream shamanism? And that's sort of what has guided me on my journey so far.
And what would you say? I mean, like for some folks who, I mean, have seen a physical craft in the sky or what they took to be physical craft in the sky, and they weren't sleeping or they weren't in some sort of like middling state of consciousness, or people who have physical remnants of whatever their encounter was, scoop marks or the various things that get listed from folks who have these abduction experiences or similar kinds of encounters. They feel like they're encountering something very real, and it sort of crosses that physico imaginable barrier by having actual impacts in the physical world. How does that get accommodated in this idea of the dream
Yeah,
method?
well, let me first and foremost say I had a missing time experience when I was 20 years old driving with my brother. And so this is an experience where I turn back to. I was sort of dozing. He was driving. We went from Minneapolis and we found ourselves in the prairies, right? No accounting for the from the on-ramp to the prairies, basically. It's just must have been hours of driving or a teleportation. We don't know what happened in
Yeah.
between. Um,
Wow.
I might have been sleeping. He wasn't, right? Because we're not dead. There's no car accident. Um, I also have physical marks on my body that had geometric properties. Four of them showed up over the last 2 years associated with my research, and they are similar in symptomology to there's one, the most famous experiencer was Stan Romanek, who had a body mark like this, but there's other experiencers who have very similar things. I wrote about one in my book. He's a public experiencer named Paul Vidal. He's been interviewed by Whitley Strieber
Yeah.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
about these marks and stuff like that. So we have it's basically the same type. He has very clear markings. I have half of my mark is clear, half of it's not. Um,
Mhm.
I still think it's dreamlike, but um, we need to bring in another concept, and you're familiar with it, which is idealism, right? The consciousness primary idea that we're in the mind of God or something like that. And
Yeah.
so to say something's dreamlike from that perspective actually means it's real in some way, shape, or form. Like I have starting this thing, I said dreams might be a fundamental technology by which these encounters unfold. And
Yeah.
so having those dreams in the physical reality, right, or the encounters might mean that we are in a different order of dreaming. And so oftentimes I think having a physical encounter with beings or craft signifies that we're all characters in one dreaming mind, something like that.
Yeah.
And it
That's
makes this, go on.
No, it's has a lot of resonance for me. I mean, if you've watched my show, that's an idea I return to over and over again. And I think whether or not the mind of God aspect of it ultimately proves out to be true in the way that people intended, I don't know. But the idea that on some level consciousness is fundamental, and that's what we've discovered with what we've come up with in quantum physics and other things over the years. I think that that's maybe what we're ultimately trending toward. Bernardo Kastrup puts together a pretty compelling argument for those sorts of things. Um, it's interesting if that's the case. I mean, then it's sort of like, I mean, every night when we go to sleep, there's the possibility that we're engaging in this much broader experiential universe than we're aware of, and we all have, there's like different classifications of dreams. There's the random dream where you kind of relive your ordinary life and go through the emotional ups and downs of, whatever mundane thing you happen to be doing. And then there's like these moments that are like super transcendent and elevating and seem to communicate information that you wouldn't natively have. Um, but I think that that notion that it somehow allows for a kind of travel or deeper level of communication is really intriguing to me. For an experiencer, how do you think that's useful? Like, I mean, you mentioned that it maybe gives you a little bit more control in the experience, or gives you some sense of, maybe definitional borders around what you're going through. But how do you think it can help people if they conceive of their contact experiences in that way?
Yeah, well, so I work with experiencers who have these experiences, powerful experiences, way beyond what I myself have experienced. I believe I've experienced only a fragment of a variety of phenomena, so that I can do the work of research and support. That's I think I've been given those experiences so I can empathize, but I'm not deeply along any one of those paths.
Yeah,
Um, and the everyone comes to me in a state of emotional agitation, right? That's why they reach out to me. They're agitated and they are obsessed about it. They are running in a circle. Was this real? Was this not? Was this real? Was this not? If it was real, what does that mean? If it's not real, what does that mean? If this is
yeah,
real, what does that mean? Right? And so they go on and they can't stop. And they I work with missing time experiencers, like they can't remember. They know something happened. Like they were a kid and they were put in bed, and then the next thing that happened was 7 hours later, they're outside and dirty feet and who knows what, right? And they can't get inside and everything was locked. So what happened? And so not knowing is really overwhelming to the conscious mind. And so when these memories of the missing time start to emerge, there's a sort of feeling of like existential anxiety, like something, my world is shifting. I don't know what's going on, what's happening. And there's a lot of edges of trickery associated with this topic. So working with them as dreams gives the capacity, first and foremost, it gives a way of working with them and discussing them. It gives a space to John Mack called it ventilate the experience, but in a way that's not necessarily in the same way as like regression hypnosis. This is the other component that I really want to bring forward in my work is regression hypnosis as performed by Bud Hopkins, David Jacobs, John E. Mack is useful, meaningful, and probably beneficial within the right context. And this is a statement that a lot of experiencers go like, heck yeah. And a lot of skeptics go, whoa, that's dangerous, right? Because of the
yeah.
false memory risks and things like that. And
Hmm.
this is the knife edge I talked to you about in a pre-interview call where I'm trying to walk, going say, yeah, that was useful and meaningful. All of those regressions, even if they were performed with leading questions, even if they had kind of unless they're extremely coercive, I think they're beneficial because it's a natural, and this is my hypothesis that the regression hypnosis is a natural shamanic interaction that if we were in any other culture, you would have a counter like this. You talk to a shaman, they go, "Oh, this is how we work with it," right?
Yeah,
And you never have that going, "Is this real? Is this not?" So having another being who is a conscious observer who has gone through these kind of reliving experiences with a dozen, 100 other people and going, you're not crazy. This is normal. It's fine. What happens next? Gives us space and time to have that ventilate. You feel validated and you have a capacity then to relate to it like a dream. And
yeah,
so, like a dream, there's certain things with dreams, right? Like they are sources of meaning, healing, and insight if you see them as such. And that's one of the interesting things. And that's why my work is kind of complicated in talking about because dreams respond to set, setting, and intention like psychedelic trips. So if you believe your dreams are meaningless and unreal, they usually don't show up as meaningful and real. Like, you think they're meaningless, they're not sources of insight. you will not treat them like sources of insight. But if you have those attitudes or shift your attitudes towards that, then your dreams start to be more meaningful and real. Similarly, you can learn to work with your dreams, like through lucid dream practices or cognitive behavioral therapy stuff, and that can shift the dreams. This is particularly like around the sleep paralysis experience,
Yeah.
why I want to talk about it, because it's so confusing. Everyone's really oftentimes just confused, scared, and they think these real things, they physically real, taking their bodies. It's like wild to think that people are going through that experience all the time. And you could just go, you don't, there's so much more. These things could be sources of inspiration, like dreams have been through our culture, right? Like back in the day, people would have dreams about science and politics and take action, and it would be innovative. And so
Yeah.
rather than being stuck in this kind of fearful moment of, does this work? Is this real? What's happening? We could shift as a culture to really honor these as dreamlike, but and honor them as sources of transformation, innovation, inspiration.
Yeah. It's sort of like treat them like a visionary kind of initiation or something along those lines. I mean, when you talk about shamanism, it's interesting that I mean, for the bulk of human history, there has been this mechanism for integrating these things and to try and draw important information out of them, and then also use them as part of the narrative for of becoming for individuals. Like they would have a some sort of experience, and then if they were working with their shaman or whatever else, there would be sort of this narrative building or contextualization that would occur. And we've lost that ability. I mean, there's um, islands of it. I mean, if you have a Jungian therapist or if you have some good friends who are very kind of plugged in or whatever, I think that you can still kind of recover some of that. But part of what I think that we're being nudged in the direction of once again learning how to take that kind of subjectivity seriously and to use it again to help improve our lives. And that's ultimately what I think that we did for so long. But because we've become, biased in the opposite direction and taught that all of that is just nonsense, then we have lost touch. And so I appreciate your work for trying to, reconnect people with that level of their own being. You mentioned that you're a hypnotist, and we talked a little bit about this when we had the our pre-conversation. And you didn't necessarily start out as someone who was interested in doing like alien regression kind of stuff, if I'm correct in saying that, and that it was eventually something that you came to. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I was interested in it, but I was in the closet even to myself for that interest. So
Okay.
I was obsessively compelled to understand my experiences. This is why I relate to the obsessive nature of experiencers who seek out hypnosis. And it was like, how does
Yeah.
it, is this real? Is this not? How do I make sense of it? And so I went to education. I went to workshops in the Bay Area, basically. I had all sorts of meditation, all sorts of offerings in the San Francisco Bay Area, just a cornucopia of transpersonal spiritual offerings, and I explored it all in order to make sense of it. As part of my education, I got inspired to get trained in hypnosis so I could work with people, and I did so because I was inspired by the work of Dolores Cannon, who developed a quantum healing hypnosis technique that and did a lot of regression work with UFO abductees. So I was inspired by her. I thought I would do that, but I wasn't brave enough to put that out there in the world. So I was like, oh, I do regular hypnosis for regular things like weight loss and smoking, or maybe a little bit of dream work, maybe a little bit of creativity work, maybe a mindfulness. And I just dabbled for years. And that was until 2020 happened. And then I realized, now's the time. The world's changing. I'm changing. I have to find a new direction. I looked back to being trained as a hypnotist with these motivations and my failure to actually activate them after college. I totally went into tech after my grad education in psychology. Like I just didn't do what I was inspired to do until 2020 happened. Um, yeah.
What do you, I mean, you are obviously an educated, very intelligent man, and you're doing this work. that takes some real courage and some, I think, bravery to kind of confront this aspect of human beingness that has, for so long, been kind of pushed into a corner and ignored or even ridiculed. Can you talk a little bit about that journey for yourself? What it was like to have to confront those perhaps societal expectations? You also mentioned a Christian background. Was there a conflict there in terms of making this pivot? How did all of that sort of coalesce or block you from, moving forward, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian church, so we were Baptists in northern Michigan. Uh, and that there's no room for aliens, there's room for angels and demons there. So that's
Yeah.
why I was saying my prayers and things like that. I started reading books when I was 16, going through the library, and that's where I encountered a lot of UFO lore and things like that. So I started realizing there's something more, and I went into science. I thought, oh, I'll be a scientist. There's ways of understanding the universe, and I realized that's ultimately, scientism is sort of a false way. So I studied philosophy, and then after that, I got jaded with things, and I thought, you know what? There's no end to the pursuit of truth, but the experience of beauty and creativity is immediate and knowable, and there's no debate. It's a subjective experience, and so that one insight is what brought me forward. And that insight was held within the study of Wassily Kandinsky, the modern painter,
Oh,
who was father of modern art. He was a landscape painter. I did landscape painting, but he shifted over to modern abstract expressionism in the context of he was inspired by the theosophical movement. So he has all sorts of spiritualist notions. And like his idea was that the artist should be a priest and should go beyond the limits of mainstream spirituality, have mystical experiences,
oh,
come back and share that through their art. And so the people consuming the art will consume some of that reality, the beyond reality, like Christians consume God in the Eucharist. So the art is like the Eucharist, the
yeah,
artist is like a priest. And so I said, I took that really seriously. And this will all reach back to how I ended up doing the work I'm doing,
yeah,
because I ended up doing a practice when I was in my early 20s that started driving me forward, which was plain air landscape painting. I would go out into the forest and field, and I would use oil paints or watercolor paints to paint the landscapes. But then I would go back at night and I would have another cycle of art, and that was involved with an internal landscape. And so I thought about going, instead of going outside, I'm going inside. How am I
yeah,
going inside? I used meditation, I used dreams, I explored astral projection, and I expressed what I experienced in those moments through my art. I ended up getting moving from visual art to written word and illustration, and I ended up building a rapport with my dreams. So I ended up having a creative practice based on dreams and dream incubation, meaning I'd go to bed with the intention to have a dream that was insightful or meaningful or would give me fuel for creativity, generally so I could make art with the motivation of being of service to others through that art.
yeah,
And then I would have an experience and then I'd write it down. I ended up getting strong download experiences associated with bizarre dreams and encounters and things like that, whatever. But I ended
yeah,
up making art. And so that is what brought me up and through all of this. And whenever I approach scare, like everything I do, even reaching out to you, there's one rational part. I go, this makes a lot of sense. I'm on board with it. But the
yeah,
thing that pushes me forward to actually send the button or sit down at the computer or do the thing is usually a dream event.
mm,
So I usually don't understand where my research is going or my writing is going or my social communications are going.
mm,
I usually found that I take those actions early in the morning after I wake up from my dream, but before my ego mind is like super engaged in censoring.
yeah,
So in that way, I approach these topics that would normally terrify me with faith in the my relationship with the dreams and
yeah.
how dreams guide create my creative practice. Um,
That's all fascinating. I deeply respect anyone who's trying to find a way or has found a way to kind of live in the experience of all of this. You know what I mean? Like instead of it being some sort of intellectual exercise or, um, you know, um, there's a lot of people who are very interested in their own theories and very egotistical about all of this. But it sounds like you're trying to explore and find ways of interfacing with reality that's guided by some of these subtle experiences and obviously your encounter with the dream world. And I just want to say I deeply respect that. I mean, I, as someone who's kind of trying to do that same thing where I do my own explorations and that fuels how I approach my show and who I talk to. It's all stuff that I think, yeah, this would be great for the show if I interviewed this person, but I only really want to talk to people if I think that there's something there that I want to
Hmm.
learn
Yep.
or some, lesson from their approach that will have meaning in my own search. So I appreciate that. One of the things that people have been talking about, I don't know if have you heard of Ray Hernandez?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, they put together the survey of experiencers, and they published several books, and they talk about different contact modalities, which include.
I wrote an article, the lucid dreaming as a contact modality for the a greater reality,
And you did.
the volume. Yes, yeah, that's in
Oh
part
wow.
how I got into doing a lot of literature reviews related to these topics. Is Ray asked me to do a literature review on lucid dreaming as a contact modality for that book, and then sort of went, "Oh my God, there's so much in this world," and looking through the other authors and things like that. So that was a really kind invitation from him. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating, and that I'm even more interested to hear what you have to say about how dreams relate to those other contact modalities. Are they all windows into a kind of dream world, or is dreaming one more aspect of this way that people can sort of perforate reality and get beyond to something deeper?
Yeah, that's a great question. I believe my personal understanding is dreaming is a sort of archetypal experience everyone goes on, and so there's a when I say it's dreamlike, I'm meaning there's a sort of movement of spiritual consciousness associated with it as well. So ultimately, I think all of the contact modalities, right, are looking at different aspects of a very similar phenomena. Um, in the literature history in the early 90s and even as early as like 1975 with a scientific proving of lucid dreaming, there's references to ET and HI contact in those experiences. So these are not abduction researchers, they are legitimate dream scientists in mainstream academia going, this could explain alien abduction. This can explain UFO abduction syndrome. There's papers written on it. There people know about that as early as 1975. So there's a strong connection between them. Um, I think it's interesting. I was the only person that in those books to write on dreams as a topic, kind of that like everyone else sort of cast them aside as a sort of maybe they're unreal. I think everyone thinks of dreams as nocturnal hallucinations that happen at night, sort of process the roast beef sandwich you had last night or whatever. Um, but that's one aspect of it, right? And there's many other aspects of dreams that are fascinating and not really well understood. So to say it's like a near-death experience makes sense to me, but we still have to bridge that. There was work in the early 90s around that I would turn to again, but
Yeah. And it seems like, I mean, at various moments we're having, I mean, you mentioned intention set and setting, like some dreams are profound and obviously meaningful to the recipient, but other dreams aren't necessarily the last half of that roast beef sandwich or whatever. So it's like at certain times it may be a contact modality or a window to something else, and other times it may just be sort of processing the subconscious, mental detritus that we all kind of accumulate through living, it's you mentioned that lucid dreaming had been scientifically proven, and you mentioned also astral travel. One of the things that the Theosophists taught was that when you're asleep, your consciousness goes somewhere else, and that is connected with what they consider the subtle bodies and astral travel and those sorts of things. Have you come to any kind of conclusions in your own thinking and research about those sorts of things, or um, not?
Yeah, I believe so. My personal belief is that there is a human skill that you could develop, most people could develop if given practice. Just like
Mhm.
running is a human skill, you can run a century, right? Like 100 miles. If you wanted to, you would just have to practice and do it, and it's hard to do it. I think the projection of the soul out of the body and the perception of objective information is possible. So that's remote viewing by way of astral projection or whatever, um, is possible and verifiable, right? Like, so you could project and see the thing that was written up over there that someone hid in a double-blind study. You could
Yeah.
do that, but it's sort of like your participants would need to have a certain level of skill. The people that proved lucid dreaming happened did so when they went into lucid dream states and moved their eyes, and we were able to record their brainwaves and things like that, verify they're in dream state, and they move their eyes in a predetermined pattern. Basically, it'll go, okay, that means you have control over it, that means you're dreaming, and things like that. So there was objective proof. The actual proving of that took a long time, and it took a lot of effort, and each attempt of one of the guys that proved lucid dreaming, this is Alan Worsley in 1975, he would spend hours trying to have a lucid dream, and if he failed to have a lucid dream, sometimes because space aliens or robots would surgically operate on his body in what he called an ultra real realm of, I don't know, like transcendent terror. He used like beautiful language around it. And I was like, wow, this is a beautiful passage. Um, so he, I think of him as like a marathon runner or a century runner. And he says it takes that much time, right, to get into these states, and it's hard to do. But there was the fruits of his labor is the objective proof of lucid dreaming. And so I think we could do that with astral projection out of body work. We're just not there. And that most of the skeptics have a very kind of, I think they call it a straw man argument against these things, where it's like, oh, you can't read this thing, or like tell me what the security lock is and get into my thing or whatever.
So
Like, of
therefore, you're not
course it's
there, or yeah,
hogwash.
yeah, yeah.
So yeah.
It's like that with most of science, though, around these topics. It's like it's not possible, so therefore it didn't happen. And if you say it happened, then you're obviously lying, or whatever.
Yeah. The as an experiencer myself, my dreams have been teaching me about the nature of lucid dreaming. Like I have the dreams that are associated with the geometric body marks I mentioned, the more powerful entity encounter dreams often end with this awareness, this dual awareness. One awareness is of my paralyzed sleeping body, like I'm aware of everything in the room. Yeah, I'm also aware of this other realm of experience. And they tell me this is what you think of as lucid dreaming. This is the goal you're seeking. This is the thing. And I'm still wrapping my mind around it. And last night, so oftentimes there's dreams that come up in my life in preparation for interactions like this. I did not have a dream last night, but my wife did, that had reference to the materials I was looking at the same time she was dreaming. And it's just I mean, it relates to, I was doing research about claims Stephen Cambion, who's a skeptic in the field, made about Chris Bledsoe regarding Christopher Gray was a paranoid schizophrenic who committed a heinous crime, live streamed it to UFO Twitter. It's horrific, trigger warning, that sort of thing. Is a murder of his father by stabbing while talking about the Bledsoes and the lady, right? So
What was
um,
this? I
I
missed
know
all of that.
I was trying to verify, does Steve Cambion have documentation that is legitimate to prove the connections? Because the Christopher Gray was written about, the murder was written about. Is the connections to the Bledsoes actually there, right? Like, is
Yeah.
this thing actually there? So I was in this really weird state of mind. My wife wakes me up this morning. She's like, I had a nightmare. I've never had a nightmare in a long time. This is so weird. I was like, oh my God, it makes sense because I was looking at this murder thing, and even then she told me the dream, and it's just like talked about the lady, right? She kept going, the lady doing this, the lady is this. I was like, are you serious? And it involved knives and things like that. Basically, the dream it's the dream for her gave a kind of symbol of UFO disclosure and confusion, or about the psyops and what's going on and things like that. And the dream went from a state of this panic, confusion, what's going on? How is this happening? This sort of danger thing. And she ended up navigating towards the end, towards one dream character who was just sitting towards the exit of this scenario where all of these things were happening. And he was just sitting in a sort of peaceful meditation. And so she sat next to him. And as she sat next to him in the dream, she stopped being panicked by the dream content, the nightmares and things like that. And she tuned into the physical awareness. She split her awareness of the dreaming experience that's happening. And then she started to become aware of her physical body, nursing the children. And then she had the choice, can I wait? I will wake up. I will wake up. And so she chose to wake up. And that was a metaphor or a communication to me about, wow, there's synchrony and like oh my God, the dream symbol, that's like a spot on symbol. The lady talking about knives, it's like the same thing I was looking at. But
Yeah.
the communication of the piece around the awareness that is tuning into the embodied sensation gave her the capacity to both be aware of the dream and the greater context and the greater reality she was in, right? Like, which is, and being able to move between them.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
That's a great story. It's interesting to me, like the idea. My wife and I often have quasi telepathic experiences where, like, I'll say, I'll think of something randomly, and then she'll come up and say the same sorts of things. Whether it's, people talk about sympathetic brain waves or whatever. Maybe there's a physical explanation in that way, or maybe that we're actually telepathically connected. But it makes you realize that your how you maintain your information space can have an impact on the people around you, and to have a little bit of informational hygiene, right? I mean, like if something you're studying in your bed next to your wife can infect her dreams, maybe we all need to be cognizant of what we're putting inside our own heads can have a broader effect on humanity as a whole. And holy shit, the internet, I mean, like we're fucking ourselves over and over again. Excuse my language, but yeah, it's suggestive in a lot of different ways.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why I'm talking about this, because it relates back to hypnosis and the regression hypnosis. So, by way of hygiene, I asked my wife if I could share this dream, and she said yes, but only on the condition that I say, she knows it'll be misinterpreted by people who hear it, and that's okay. She has sharing it in order to help raise consciousness of people who might be confused about dreaming and UFO disclosure or something like that. So she gave me that condition. I'm honoring that condition. There's ethics
Cool
and
enough.
epistemologies related to dream work that I love talking about, and I always point to. Often they involve like going like, hey, just so you know, dream work is triggering. It's taboo and it involves unconscious things. So if like one of the things that happens when people start doing dream work is they get a lot of nightmares because the unconscious is going, oh, thank God, you can finally hear my messages. I'll give you a lot of messages you've been ignoring for a while. Um, but the hygiene thing, right? This sort of contamination that um, in the missing time regression hypnosis, which pushed forward the ET contact narrative and is the basis in part for why everyone believes in UFOs and NHIs, because Ralph Blumenthal and Leslie Kane, who are deeply connected with missing time hypnotists, they believe it. So there's like a connection there. I got into this sort of dream interpretation of missing time regression because I realized, right, as a hypnotist, there's no way I can prevent leading questions or being a contaminant, right?
Mhm.
There's no way I can be a pure forensic person. I'm not trained that well. No one can do that. If they can do
Yeah.
that, they're lying to you. It's just they don't understand. No one understands humans enough to say they can never suggest something. So then I needed to find a context where that contamination is okay and appropriate and ethical. And I found that container in dream shamanism within the Western literature that I use dream shamanism because Stanley Krippner wrote about it, and there's writing about it in our literature. But the shamanic practices in general form the precedent for how we can relate to each other without that form of contaminant that we might be concerned about, or a way to manage that, in other words.
So, I mean, that's it's interesting to me. How would you say that the shamanistic approach makes it so that the contamination isn't as much of an issue, or is itself part of the interpretive lens? I take it that's what you mean, right? That if you're in that exchange, like any contamination that occurs would just help to further along the interpretation of whatever is at issue. Is that correct? I mean,
Fundamentally, so the experience of contamination, so it shifting it from the notion of forensic kind of memory retrieval to shamanism
yeah, like I'm going to reach in there and
shifts.
pull out a perfect memory or whatever. I mean, you give that up, right? And that's not what the goal is. Is that
Yeah. Yeah, you stick your hand in and pull something up and you have to go, what is this? Shamanism makes you go, what is this? A principle of dream shamanism is interpretation. No matter what, they go, hey, there's big dreams, there's little dreams, there's roast beef dreams, there's alien dreams, right? And you have to interpret them. And your mode of interpretation comes to you through initiatory experiences, through cultural experiences. So then it gives us a context. We go like, we have to understand how we interpret dreams. We have to go through a process of interpretation, no matter what. And so that already sets up a really different context and expectations for the regression hypnosis. And then the purpose of why you would do that is really different, right? So regression hypnosis to retrieve forgotten memories of abuse or trauma or whatever has a very specific purpose. But shamanism generally is for a variety of reasons, generally understood to be for the benefit of the person or the community. And that's through relationships with the human and non-human world, mediating them through sort of initiatory systems of knowledge and communication. And so when we go, okay, we're doing a shamanic thing here, the the memory experience that could be a healing, that could be insightful, that could be meaningful, but it's not necessarily held as memory. It's held as a shamanic thing within a context that's alive and culturally meaningful and that uses that interaction for, I would hope to see the benefit of the community. That's why that part of my hygiene is to establish those principles and agreements between the people I work with and myself.
so? If we were to, I mean, I think that sounds wonderful. But if we were to apply this to the UFO subject or the NHI subject generally, how would that change? How would that change what we're doing as a field? I mean, what does that look like in terms of utility for how we approach experiencers and even the the flashy lights in the sky or the secrets that the government held? I mean, like, where does that shift us? Where does that put us?
Yeah, it shifts the center of gravity from secret government places, right? Because with the UFO thing, there's lights in the sky, things happening, there's aliens here, maybe there's bodies, maybe there's a secret knowing that needs to come forward and be disclosed. And so there's this disclosure narrative thing happening, and the experiencers and people watching experiencers think, oh, okay, that disclosure of information will validate the experiences that they had perhaps in these dreamlike experiences. So there's a sense of disempowerment and victimization. And the UFO abduction syndrome, as defined in the 1990s by these people, is defined by trauma and victimization. There's no sense that they literally explain how there's no power we have as humans to work with this. And so shifting the center of gravity of power from the aliens and the secret governments back to the dreamer enables us to do a lot, right? Like I really do believe, right? Like if we shifted that power back to the experiencers and the experiencers chose to do a dream incubation experience, like they go to bed to have a dream of insight or like I've done with my books, then these experiencers would receive downloads and communications maybe about anti-gravity, maybe about all the technology that's coming forward, maybe to prevent some of the catastrophes that they see in the prophecies within their experiences. So that for me is really worth it, right? Because energetically, I was unable to put my foot on the gas when I was expecting disclosure to come from the activities of David Grush and the Congress and things like that. I really want those to come to light, actually. I think transparency and all this stuff that they've done is probably really interesting. But the thing I was hoping for and yearning for to be disclosed to me out of those activities, I now see as I'm 100% in control of to have that experience myself. And so my hope is that if many people sort of take that power back and sort of explore this, then psi phenomena may emerge more, right? Then like that actually is a thing, right? Like the belief pattern around people, right? The stuff I've done with my family is remarkably different than the stuff I've done as a solo single man. So I can imagine that there's a transformation associated with that. I'd love to see.
So you mentioned yourself though that like shamanism implies an initiatory, body of knowledge. Like people and traditionally would, apprentice under a shaman, and there would be a lot of cultural history and oral history that goes into sort of qualifying someone to play that role. We don't have that right now. There is no, backlog of shaman that have culminated in a line that it reflects sort of the collective wisdom of society to help us interpret. So how do we know who we can trust as an arbiter of meaning when we don't have how do you create shaman from nothing, I guess, is the question. Like, or who do we trust to be our shaman when that seems like it's absolutely key to getting at what some of the meaning behind all of this may be?
Really good question. One of the principles of shamanism, as identified by the cross-cultural people, anthropologists, is called the shamanic principle. Is basically in these shamanic cultures, everyone's the shaman, right? Everyone is like you do the shamanic activity when you talk about your dream, interpret it, and take action on it. And so there's a self-correcting system. As soon as you open that loop of going, I'm paying attention to my dreams, they're worthwhile. You change your attitudes, you change your intention, you change your mindset, and then all of a sudden there's a feedback cycle. There's entities out there, right? The dream characters, they will show up. They want to help. They will do that. I know for a fact, like in my life, they've done that for me. When I've seen myself, I go, okay, I'm the arbiter of that interpretation for me, and I've expanded my capacity through observations of my states and psychedelics and meditation and all sorts of things. And so I've increased my capacity for discernment, but every single person has that capacity themselves and can complete that cycle with the shamanic realm. And it's generally not a big deal. The specialized people, right, like me as a missing time regressionist, that's a specialized type, right? Like I had some kind of body illnesses stuff. I went to talk to shaman about it, right? And because I needed this sort of there was spiritual sickness associated with some of my researching, and I was like had to go to went to a shaman, had some interaction there. But that was a specialized case. So I think most of us are capable of tuning into it. The final thing I'll say about that is in the West, we do have precedent for that. And I look to the Platonists and Neoplatonists, particularly John Dee is the last major
That's so
figure.
funny that you
Yeah,
mentioned him because I've just read a book about him. Anyway,
right.
that's a synchronicity.
Great. So he's actually a shaman of our culture. I look to him as the some of my argument in the about hypnotists say he's actually our precedent for missing time regression hypnosis rather than mesmer or something like that or animal magnetism. It's like no, that's not it. It's actually this sort of scrying activity John Dee did.
So you're basically saying that we can take ownership of our own shamanic kind of interpretation and rights of our own dreams, maybe in a community setting, because that would help us to sort of buffer ourselves. But I mean, do you think that, I mean, because it seems like globally, or I mean, in this topic, there's all these different islands of people who have different approaches and different takes on what's happening, and there is no coherent place for someone to go when they begin to have these experiences to sort of throw it all on the table and say, what do I do? Where they're not going to be judged, and maybe those things are communities are starting to build, but if that were a reality, I think that we could begin to build a little bit of a sort of interpretive community that could help strengthen. This isn't really a question, more of an observation, but the state of things right now cries out for um, a community to form where these kinds of practices would be welcomed and maybe taught and encouraged. Anyway,
Yeah, and I see that happening with like experiencer group and
yeah,
the school like people are turning to go, "Oh, let's look at this, the psionic conversation with the whistleblowers." Um, I often am nervous about which communities and how they are formed in the intersection of intelligence community narratives. All that stuff is really concerning to me. And yet
yeah,
that's why I come back to the individual's capacity as like a manifestation of the shamanic principle. Like you can do it yourself. And uh, I would say to anyone contemplating this journey, the first thing I need to say is that the shamanic path, like you mentioned and tuned into, involves initiatory experiences. Like with dreams, they sometimes start with nightmarish experiences. There's a spectrum of human experiences from nightmarish to transcendent, and opening to this path opens up to that no matter what. And so it's not for the faint of heart necessarily. It's good to be supported by a community. It's good to not do it alone. There's a lot. The experience I have seen looking out is that many people feel there's a sense of isolation and there's not many communities out there. But then as they tune in to their own self, they go, oh, there's people over here talking about it. Oh, there's people over there talking about it. And so there's a sort of gentle awakening. Um, and I'm not sure how that will unfold necessarily.
yeah. Through conversations like this, I
Yeah.
hope that's
Yeah.
part of what I'm trying to encourage. Now, integral studies, is that Ken Wilber's school? I mean, ultimately, is that sort of the root of what that comes from?
Yeah. So, um, integral study is a funny term because it comes, yes, Ken Wilber, and my integral studies comes from California Institute of Integral Studies. That comes from Hardis Chowdhury, who's the founder of the school, who came from Sri Aurobindo. Is in
Yeah.
the integral was the integrating the East and the West, Eastern
Oh,
spirituality, Western psychology.
okay.
Now that's what Ken Wilber was all about too.
Yeah.
And many people who are interested in that are interested in Ken Wilber, so there's cross-contamination. And then there's a third tradition of integral from somewhere. The book Integral Dreaming
Yeah.
talks all about this. And there's like a graphic I really appreciate. And they're like, there's three paths. We're all of them. We're none of them. That's what integral is. And so yeah, that's how I kind of identify. But yes, integral studies with at least the PhD school is definitely based on the Ken Wilber integral.
Which I find, I mean, I've read some of his books. I find him utterly fascinating. One of the things that as I've been discussing this work, like a lot of times it comes up, how do we help society to embrace these sorts of things and then also sort of confront a lot of the problems that it seems to be facing, the existential crises that, more than half the population seems content to ignore. And he talks about the basically the levels of consciousness that different people are at, and that if you're in one level of consciousness, then you're loyal to your family group, whatever your particular in group is, maybe your ethnicity, or even up to your nation, and that's basically as far as your empathy will stretch. And then you have a lot of outgroups. But the higher you go up on the consciousness scale, the more global your perspective gets, and you get to have, I mean, I think ultimately a perspectival, maybe the one of the higher realms. But anyway, you get to a place where you have a sort of global ecological view of reality, the human species, and problem solving. But communication between the various groups of people who of different consciousnesses, communication is almost impossible because they're not speaking the same language, and you can't force people to evolve up or down the scale by virtue of social pressure or education or anything else. And it's a much deeper, more fundamental process than that. So it almost puts us in a place that seems virtually insoluble in terms of trying to create um, a sort of mass human movement for people to wake up because everyone's moving at their own rates and on their own scale. And so building cohesion is almost impossible. And this whole conversation sort of fits in with that because I hear a lot about, we're in the middle of this consciousness evolution and that we're all as a species, this is the big waking up. And, we're suddenly going to enter, the next density or whatever the particular language is. But we're still all over the scale, and that cohesion, I don't see how it's going to come. Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, just someone who's a student of some of these things.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of thoughts. The first one is the answer comes from my wife's dream, so I'll give her that credit. You know, so in the dream, she was set the dream scenario was she's in a hotel building complex and there's many people milling about. There's organizers to the an event, right? So um that might be disclosure, that might be whatever, that might be the ascension. Um, the lady gives her a briefcase full of knives and gives her a big jagged knife. She goes, "Okay, I have to hide this." She hides it under a rug that's at the bottom of a pool. There's people filling into the pool to be part of the event. The event organizers flip a switch, turn and electrifies the pool. The people turn into light bodies, have the people turn into light bodies and disappear. The other half turn into something like zombies. And so she freaks out. She goes up, up, up. And then there's people from the apartment buildings coming out and with battery phone chargers. So another kind of electricity thing. She goes, those are like the experiencers in this situation that are like UFO contactees who are sharing their message or
Mm.
whatever. And so we have three different people already at the end case of their kind of linear expansion up. So that's one thing about integral studies is it has a evolution of consciousness thing. And so there's different good heaven for each of those stages or whatever. So she's experienced it as she's going up. She's concerned about figuring out who's the right group to be with. There's panic in the air, is building to an event. The event organizers say, you all have to go out now. There's tour buses outside. It's chaos. And then she looks down, and that's where she sees the man sitting next to the door, kind of in meditation, just peaceful. He's not out of the situation, but he's the only one not in panic. And she sits down next to him, and she can then become aware of her greater reality and then have the context. And so the insight she was saying, all you have to do, she told me this. This is her interpretation. She's like, all you have to do is kind of chill out, sit down, tune in, step back from that panic and that sort of heightened kind of energy of that evolution of consciousness even and be
Yeah.
present. And then you can step into this greater reality where all of that evolution of consciousness kind of makes sense as what it is. Um,
Yeah.
there's an intellectual response I'd love to talk about, but that actually is the response from my heart. I'd love to just because it comes from
No,
my wife and it's the dream world and stuff like that.
no, I love it. And that's a very powerful dream. I mean, for this moment in history and in the this sort of ephemeral subject, I think that that's really impactful and meaningful. For folks who are new to all of this, I mean, I'm going to refer folks to your website where your books are, and so people can dive a little bit deeper. But if someone wants to begin to engage in kind of this, shamanic practice, or just sort of take ownership of what they're going through, or even if they haven't had experiences, want to begin to cultivate some kind of contact in this regard, how would you suggest they begin?
Yeah, specifically, I would recommend. I have an app. In in this is it's like it's a pay what you will. You can do a pay what you will donation. If money's an issue, you email me. I'll give you a free one. So it's not like I'm grifting or selling it,
Sure,
but I do
I'm
need
not.
to. I'm I was spent 4 years building it. There was a team. It's beautiful. It is like the reason, and it's a research-based app for sleep, dream, and mindfulness. Sleep, dream, and mindfulness. And It's like I started that in 2020 or 2021, right at the same time I started my practice, and I was like, this has got to be solid from a mainstream research perspective because I'm doing really far out work with experiencers, and they need a resource to figure out how can I approach this stuff. Like the best thing you can do is learn a little bit about dreams and practice a lot of mindfulness. And that's, I think, for any that's my recipe for any kind of, if you want to experience more, if you want to experience less, if you want to know more about these things, if you want to get into shamanism, being able to pay attention to your dreams, remember, record them, to incubate dreams, to be mindful and present. So the app has teachings. It's you sign up for it. It gives you courses, a 6-day course. Each day you get like 1 or 2 minutes of audio. You listen to it. It teaches a little bit. It guides you through that. And so that's called Dreamwell. You can get to that at dreamwellbewell.com. It's on the app and Play Store. Um,
Okay.
the education there is beautiful. It's packaged and whatever, but it's education and research you can get anywhere, just about mindfulness, like general mindfulness. And it only matters in what really matters is that you practice it and you find it meaningful. So if like the Dreamwell situation doesn't work for anyone, I say find the mindfulness practice that works for you. And that might be dancing or art if it's not sitting still or whatever. But it is a practice of being with yourself,
Yeah.
and developing that capacity. Same thing with working with imagery as it comes up, the irrational mind and how to bridge those. The Western mind is not really familiar with that. It's that we need help and guidance, but it's all around us in the world. And as soon as you start opening up to that, synchronicities come in, guidance comes in, magical books sort of show up, and you can follow that. But with a great basis in mindfulness and the capacity to like remember or intend to have dreams, you'd be set up really well to navigate this world.
So, one last thing I wanted to cover, you mentioned your research and what you're doing. Can you describe for us what your research entails and what you ultimately hope to accomplish with the material that you're gathering?
Thank you. Yeah, the research I'm doing right now, I'm at the California Institute for Human Sciences. I wrote my entrance essay explicitly. I am going to research extraterrestrial and non-human intelligence contact and dreams. Like explicitly, this is what I'm doing. It's an accredited program, and I made that explicit declaration in the in my documentation because I thought, wouldn't it be interesting? Like nobody else in an accredited institute has this like very explicitly defined credulous research focus. So I'm believing in experiencers. I might go, is this dreamlike? Is how do you experience this? Right? Like
Yeah.
that's my skeptical question. Tell me how you experience this. How else have you experienced similar things? And then maybe it is dreamlike, maybe it's not. But I never go like, you never experienced that, or and I always include the questions like, what have you, well, how do you interpret it? So my research up until this point has been around theory and literature review because you do coursework and then you learn stuff and then you design a study. I'm just doing literature review at this time, going, what is the shape of this field right now?
What's the state of play or whatever, right? Yeah.
State of play. And I've determined it's dangerous right now. I've determined it's dangerous and because it has unacknowledged ethical time bombs, right? The work related to David Jacobs, Bud Hopkins, John Mack around the UFO abduction syndrome and the work with regression hypnosis as a fundamental basis for the epistemology, the way of knowing of the entire UFO disclosure movement is unsteady. It is like building a castle on sand. It will fall down and hurt people. And so I got to a spot with that where I said, I need these ethical concerns resolved. I need to have them resolved. I can't resolve them myself as an individual researcher. So I wrote a 250-page treatise, sent it to my program director about all these things. He goes, whoa, dude, that's too much. You know, I was like, and so I brought it down to 20 pages and I submitted that as a justification for an ethical leave of absence from my study. So I'm now in this sort of leave of absence status for ethical reasons, and those ethical reasons caused me to stop doing my practice for about a year. So there were financial reasons too. I go like, I can't continue in this way without resolving these ethical conundrums.
Yeah.
So I've submitted that as an official kind of through official channels, and I'm waiting to hear back from an official response from the Institute about these ethical concerns. Because there's a there's a couple of things in the UFO disclosure movement where you go, actually, if we translate this to mainstream academia, this looks like coercion and it looks like manipulation and it looks harmful. And we can't have that. So I'm trying to clear the field of that by transmuting the issues of regression hypnosis into dream work or something more transpersonal so that there's a literature basis that's grounded in accredited research institute statements or whatever, something solid that the research can like hang on because there's
Anchor
nothing
itself
solid
to.
there.
Yeah.
Um, that's where I'm at now.
That's a load of work. I mean, you can't, like you said, you can't do that as an individual. Do you feel like there's any kind of groundswell of support for what you're hoping for, or is that going to be decades in the making, that kind of switch?
Oh, I think it's already there. I think everyone I talk to are really on board with it. I think everybody knows that like the John Mack from 1992 to 1994 is confused by Bud Hopkins stuff, and then everybody knows Bud Hopkins went a little bit too far and all this stuff, but nobody was is afraid to connect those dots. Everyone's afraid to connect those dots and say something because even with like Karen Austin, right, the director of,
Uh,
in your
I had
interview,
a fascinating conversation
yeah,
last
she
week.
talked about her not abduction experiences, but abduction narratives. And she said, I don't want to get in trouble with the community. And so you can read between the lines, what's going on there, right? And so there's a integral studies thing, like you talked about, the elevation of consciousness and the worldviews coming along with the community. And they're going, oh, okay, this stuff way back then may not have been what we understand it to be now. And so there needs to be a sort of clearing and coming together and coherence in that. We're
Yeah,
not there yet. And um, I see people as being supportive. I get afraid about communicating in these ways because it's oh, experience is dreamlike, alien abduction is dreams. Like that's an offensive thing that people have heard for decades that have
to
minimized their
dismiss their experience.
experiences.
Yeah, exactly. But that's not what you're doing. I mean, you're very careful, and
Thanks.
my viewers are nuanced, so I mean they'll hear it. There are always sharks in the water, though, who want to tear everyone down. So I'm sure that that's always a risk. But I appreciate the fact that you are trying to walk this nuanced line, and by doing so, kind of both reclaim some information from the past, but then also kind of put a healthier lens on it, so that it's not all that it was cracked up to be, or whatever. I mean, I re I never really got into the Bud Hopkins, David Jacobs research. I read some of their books, but it was entirely too dark for me, and it didn't seem like it bore out. And it hasn't. One of the interesting things that I wrestle with now, and I mentioned it to Karen also, is the change in experience that has gone on. Like in the 80s and 90s, abduction was a big part of what everyone was going through, but now that's shifted, and people are reporting downloads and more kinds of positive visionary experiences. And I wonder what's at root there. Um, you know, yeah, I wonder what's at root with all of it. But
Yeah, that's where I want to get to. Some of the other research I'm doing, I mean, I talked about the false memory kind of ethical concerns that have taken my really distracted everything. It's professionally, academics, it's like wind out of my sails. Oh my God, it was awful. But I'm doing this research because I'm fascinated by the stories, and I do collection of dream reports and reports of experience at a massive level. So Karen Austin talked about the kind of large language model analysis of her stuff. I don't use large language models. I use a method based in social sciences, statistics, it's content analysis. And so if you go to dictionary.dreamwellbewell.com, and I'm so proud of this work, actually, we have 200,000 dreams from academic
Wow.
databases, the internet. We have the most sophisticated analysis of those dreams. And a way you type in, you can see you can see all like dreams about aliens and light beings and orbs in the dictionary and angel like, and so it gives you a statistical report about what those are. And I build software, I'm building software and have done it for years to analyze those things. And some of the research I hope to bring forward is uh, enough research to kind of ground those tools in literature and to
Yeah.
empower the researcher community and the experiencer community to really go, people are experiencing this. This is what they're experiencing. These are reports. This is how it compares to this group, and this group. Um, that stuff takes a lot of time, energy, and effort, but I've got great working examples of it. You can download all of my research papers. I analyzed those 200,000 dreams as if they could give us insight about the UFO abduction syndrome. So that paper walks through the unusual personal experiences booklet and looks at the 200,000 dreams and says, can we get insight about those massive that from the massive database of dreams and apply it to this? It's like, yeah, actually we can. There's things that are interesting, and like the dream loops came up out of that. I was like so surprised. I was like, oh my God, the dream loops is a thing. I had no idea, but um, so that's one part of research I'm really excited to do, and I'll do that no matter what happens in terms of the ethics around this, because it is a really a statistical method of counting what's out there in the world. Uh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was a fantastic conversation, man. Thank you so much. And if you ever want to come back and update us on your work, or if there's any way we can ever help, feel free to get in contact and we can do
Thank
that.
you. Thank you.